All right. Glad you guys can join me. This is the second time I'm doing this because the first time I did it, it didn't record because I didn't hit the record button. So this is a rerun. You wouldn't have known that unless I told you, but glad you can join me. And if you're joining in for the first time, it's the first time you're watching, this series of videos. This is indeed a series of videos. So we've been going over the 5 facts of the resurrection. This is the 4th video. So I encourage you to circle back and watch those other videos so you know kind of what we're talking about here, because they do kind of build upon each other. But really thankful that, you guys have been enjoying this. It seems I've gotten some good feedback. And I want to encourage you, I hope that you do more research on this topic, because we're kind of just scratching the surface. And a lot of, if not almost all the information I've gotten has been from this book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. So I encourage you to read that. It was written by Gary Habermas and then this guy named Michael Licona. But I really like the book because it's simple, and it does one of two things. It gives you the information, but then also it trains you on like how to present that information, and it helps you with memorization tools and things like that. And so there's actually also a whole section that's dedicated to dealing with objections, and so it's really helpful. And it even comes with the CD that helps kind of train us up on these things. So if you have some time, I know a lot of us have more time than typical, go ahead and pick up the book and read through it, and you'll find that pretty much most of what I've said here is found in the book. But with that being said, I want to kind of open up my PowerPoint here, and just want to do a quick review of what we've covered so far. And so we call it a quintet of facts, but we call it the 4+1. And that's because the first 4 facts we've discussed are unanimously agreed upon. You know, when you have scholars studying the issues that are taking it serious, that are doing it in an honest way, that are well educated, there's 4 facts that are just unanimously agreed upon by Christians and agnostics and atheists alike. And the first one, of course, was Jesus was crucified. And we proved that. Obviously we have the New Testament text. We have 4 Gospels that are witnesses to the fact Jesus was crucified, and, other places in the New Testament. But then on top of that, you have secular sources as well. You have people like Tacitus and Josephus, people who were not Christians or part of the Christian movement, and if anything, really despised the Christian movement. And yet they attest to Jesus having been killed. And so that one was pretty easy to establish. Secondly, the disciples believed he rose from the dead. Now we're able to prove this by virtue of looking at the facts and seeing historically that all these apostles, all these disciples, all these initial witnesses, or those who claim to be witnesses, they didn't only proclaim that he rose from the dead, but they were willing to die for it. And so they went to the grave knowing whether or not what they were proclaiming was true or a lie. And they died for it. It's interesting. You might think of Joseph Smith, and there was in the Mormon Church supposedly 11 witnesses to the golden plates that were given to Joseph Smith. But did you know that 6 of those 11 witnesses left the Mormon Church? Imagine if 6 of the apostles just turned their backs on Jesus and left the church. That would be really troubling for our faith. Instead, what you see is every single one of them. Historically, we know that many of them died for their faith, but all of them remained faithful till the end, with the exception of Judas, who betrayed Jesus and never saw him, as far as we know, in a resurrected state. And so we're able to look at that and prove that. But James, the skeptic and brother of Jesus, was converted. This is our 3rd fact, where people say, well, maybe the disciples made up the stories about Jesus because they wanted it to be true so bad. But James doesn't fit that mold. He was a skeptic, and he was a brother of Jesus. And he's saying, I don't believe that my brother's the Christ. In fact, they thought he was crazy. But then all of a sudden you get James, and he goes from being a skeptic to now in Acts, 15, we see it. But historically, we see that he becomes, really an icon, a leader in the early Christian church? How do you go from skeptic thinking Jesus is crazy to all of a sudden being, a leader in the church? Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, it says that Jesus revealed himself and appeared to James. And that's really powerful when we see that change, that profound change in James' life. Similar with Paul, who not only was a skeptic, you see, James, he was a skeptic of Jesus, and he was trying to save Jesus from his craziness, right? But Paul, he was a skeptic, and he was a persecutor of the church. I often wonder maybe if Paul was there or around, and was witness to the crucifixion. Who knows? We may never know. But Paul, he wasn't just a skeptic. He wasn't like, I'm not sure about this, but he was certain that he was right, that Jesus was a blasphemer, and that the Christian movement was totally wrong, right? We're talking about more than a skeptic. He was having people drug off to prison and physically persecuted, and he talks about it himself. But all of a sudden, he's converted. It converted to the point where he also is now being persecuted. He's enduring the persecutions that he once played a part in dealing out. How do you go from persecutor to persecuted? He says, in Acts, we have an account of it, so Luke attests to it, but Paul also refers to a time in his life where Jesus appeared to him. A drastic change deserves a drastic explanation, don't you think? And certainly Paul went through a drastic change. Now here's the fifth fact. And again, the reason we call it 4 + 1 is because these first four are unanimously agreed upon. But finally we get to the empty tomb, and it's more so about 75% think the tomb was empty. I would say that the reason why the number is a little lower is because they understand the implications if the tomb was empty. And perhaps they're not looking at the evidence as honestly as they should be, because I think that we can make a good case that the tomb was empty. But nonetheless, there are critics of the empty tomb, as we all know. But can we all agree that an empty tomb would make for compelling evidence to the resurrection? I mean, on its own, it would help, but it also just helps, reaffirm the facts that we just discussed, those first four. And so that's why I also want to be clear, it really would be compelling evidence, but our evidence doesn't solely rest on proving this point. I think that the testimony of the apostles, the conversion of James and the conversion of Paul, and their willingness to die for what they claim to have a witness, to be primary witnesses of, I think that in and of itself is very compelling. So the empty tomb is kind of like a bonus that gives us more confidence in what they were claiming. And so what you're left with in this book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, he lays out and lists 45 different critical scholars who believe the tomb was empty. And I think that's impressive. We're not just talking about people on Twitter and Facebook, but we're talking about people that hold doctorates and masters and have dedicated their whole lives to studying history and New Testament texts, and they believe that the tomb was empty. Not necessarily that Jesus was the Christ or that he raised from the dead, but they believe the tomb was empty. Habermas, Gary Habermas, he identified more than 100 scholars who accept one or more arguments in favor of the empty tomb. Now it's interesting because on the other side, there's only 35 who accept one or more arguments against it. And so what that tells us is the explanations and the arguments for an empty tomb are more convincing than arguments against there being an empty tomb. In other words, arguments that say the tomb was not empty. People have a harder time accepting that. And so you see it's about a 3-to-1 ratio. But in all, there are probably about 23 arguments for the tomb. And maybe you're kind of splitting hairs when you're counting up some of those, and maybe there's more arguments that come out as you have other thinkers on the issues and maybe other archaeological evidence or whatever it may be. But all in all, there's 23 arguments for the empty tomb. And so I just want to talk about a few of them. There's 3 that I just want to bring up and bring to your attention and hopefully cause you to think about. And the first one simply is this. We call it the Jerusalem factor. Now, if you're going to make up a story about things that happened in Salem, Oregon, we're talking fantastical stories. Maybe you want to make up stories about how great you were or something like that. Wouldn't you go and tell those stories to someone who is way far away from, where they can actually trace the evidence? You would want to start talking about things that happened in Salem when you're thousands of miles from there and there's no chance that anybody can go back there and see that I'm making all this up. Well, that's not what you have with the gospel. Certainly the gospel reached all ends of the earth, but it started in Jerusalem. The gospel was first preached in the place where all these events were originally said to have taken place, the miracles of Jesus, walking on water, dying on the cross, rising from the dead. This message was first preached in Jerusalem. And even Tacitus, a critical scholar, he says that this was the origin of the disease, is what Tacitus, a Roman historian, called Christianity. He called it a disease. He says it started in Judea, in Jerusalem. And so I want to ask, it would be impossible for Christianity to get off the ground if the tomb was not empty, wouldn't it? Would it even be possible for Christianity to explode and become what it did, 3,000 baptized in one day? Would it be possible for that to happen if all you had to do is walk a mile, 2 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, and just go check the tomb and see if it was indeed empty? Would it be possible for Christianity to explode if the tomb wasn't empty? I would say it would be very, very difficult. But it seems like when you read Acts chapter 2, it seems to me, and Luke doesn't just blatantly point out this fact, but when you're reading the text, it becomes obvious to me that it was common knowledge that the tomb was empty. And this is day of Pentecost, 50 days after Jesus had been killed. And Peter's preaching this sermon. We could title it Jesus of Nazareth. And he brings up Psalm 16. And it's this psalm about how, his flesh will dwell in hope, and that his flesh won't see corruption. His Holy One won't see corruption. That's, decay. That's how you could also translate that. You'll make known to me the paths of life. There's many who thought this referred to David, King David of the Old Testament. But Peter says it's not so. And he says, here's how we know. He says in verse 29 of Acts chapter 2, brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. That's interesting that he points them to David's tomb. Because it's true that Jesus died, Jesus was buried, but unlike David, his tomb was not with them that day. In other words, you go and check the tomb of Jesus, it was empty. That seemed to be common knowledge, and it was a central point to Peter's sermon. And it was a central apologetic to this psalm not being in reference simply to David. The tomb was empty. David's tomb wasn't. So I'll ask this, if the tomb wasn't empty, why was no corpse produced? I mean, think about it. You have all these people that want Christianity to be false, right? Rome doesn't want this movement to happen, the Roman government. Jews don't want this movement to happen because, well, we see that because they killed Jesus. And we see that even in the book of Acts, and you see the apostles being thrown in jail and whipped, and they're charged not to preach this message. And so wouldn't they want to go out of their way to put an end to it if they could, if it was possible? One of the easiest ways to put an end to Christianity is if they just dropped Jesus's body in the middle of the court and said, here's your Savior. He's dead. Wouldn't that put an end to it? And it only happened 50 days later. There's been scientists and things that look at how bodies decay, and they say Jesus's body would still be identifiable, especially in that climate, in a tomb. It would still be identifiable as him if you pulled it out of the tomb and put it before the people. if they had the body, if the tomb wasn't empty, why didn't they just drop the body in front of those early Christians and put an end to all of it? Instead, they never do. And what's interesting actually is that rather than providing proof that the tomb wasn't empty, they actually provide proof that the tomb was empty. And so in Matthew chapter 28, we learn about this early argument against Christianity, against the resurrection. They said that the disciples stole him away while we were asleep. That the disciples stole the body away, and that's why the tomb is empty. Now, it's interesting because that actually helps our case. In the same way that, if somebody says the dog ate their homework, they're admitting to the fact that they don't have homework, right? And so by saying that the disciples stole him away from the tomb, they're admitting that the tomb was empty. The tomb was empty. Now, we could deal with that argument really easily by just pointing to the fact that the disciples died. If they lied and they knew it was a lie, why were they willing to die? Every single one of them. There's not a single one of them that turned their back on it. They all died. And furthermore, when we read the Gospels, they all scatter once Jesus gets arrested. Peter betrays him. They're all in their own homes. They're in their own homes even after the 3 days, and the women are discovering the empty tomb. They're nowhere to be found until we're later introduced to them in those accounts. But that's the argument. The disciples stole him away, and in making that argument, they confess that the tomb was empty. So you have enemy attestation, right? You have the Jerusalem factor, enemy attestation. By the way, this argument is also spoken of by Justin Martyr, who's an early Christian. And so it was still something that was circulating in the early 2nd century, early 3rd century. Tertullian talks about it. And what's really interesting is that this is the only early opposing theory known of when we talk about the empty tomb. Why was the tomb empty? The only early argument that they had was the disciples stole the body. There's no other argument. There's no other argument that they have early on. Now, today, people have formulated and came up with different theories, but early on, this was the only opposing theory, that the disciples stole the body. So you have enemy attestation. Finally, this one is controversial. When we're talking about gender and women's roles early on, but keep in mind, these aren't things that reflect how God feels about women, and they're not things that reflect how I think about women. But they're just kind of the facts of the day that they were dealing with back then. Women had an uphill battle in the 1st century, and in that Jewish culture and Roman culture. And so what's interesting is that in all 4 Gospels, women are the first to witness the resurrection. All 4 Gospels, they're in unanimous agreement on that. In Matthew and Mark, they're the only primary witnesses listed. In other words, they're the only ones that are witness to actually see Jesus, and be the first ones to see Jesus in the empty tomb. In Luke and John, the other disciples are mentioned, but they're mentioned after the women as primary witnesses. So in all 4 accounts, the women are the primary witnesses. Now, it's interesting when you look at the historical context, because if you're going to make up a story about Jesus being the Messiah, it would be hard to explain why you would have females as being the primary witnesses. And actually, we're going to see that this would hurt your credibility, and this would hurt your chances of making this story spread and seem viable for people to believe in. And here's why. I have a few quotes actually that outline kind of how Jews viewed women during that day. One quote in the Talmud says, "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." This is not the Bible. This is Jewish secular writings that are talking about how women were viewed and treated around that time. Another quote from the Talmud: "The world cannot consist without males and without females. Happy is he whose children are males, and woe to him whose children are females." Josephus, a Jewish historian, he says, Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probable that they may not speak truth, either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment. Finally, the last one is from the Talmud. Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Also, they are not valid to offer. This is equivalent to saying that one who is rabbinically accounted a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. In other words, that last quote is saying that the testimony and account of a woman is as reliable as that of a criminal or a robber. Why, if you were making up a story, would you have the initial testimony, the initial witnesses, be and hinge upon women? To us, it's not a big deal, but back then, that really would have hurt your case more than it would have helped it if you're talking about making up a lie and having people believe it. And so that's something that has to be considered. And that's why I like the gospel, before we get to that next slide. That's why I like the gospels and really the Bible as a whole, because the Bible contains these miraculous things that when you come upon them for the first time, they can be hard to believe. But they always have this hint of truth. They always have this hint of truth. And I think the reason why the Gospels have women being the first witnesses, despite that hurting their credibility, I think the reason why they did that is because it was true. They're just giving a historical account of what happened. Otherwise, why not, if you're making it up, why not avoid the issue altogether? Why not have Nicodemus be the first one to witness? Or why not have Joseph of Arimathea who gave his tomb for Jesus to be buried? And why not have these two men be the first to witness? But instead, we see how much the Lord values women by revealing himself first to them. And we see the truthfulness of the gospel by saying that, you know, this is what was reported, despite the fact that some people wouldn't have liked it back then. And so this guy named William Wand, he was a University of Oxford church historian. He was a professor there, really smart guy, obviously, if you're a professor at Oxford. But he says all the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history. So if you're going to reject the tomb, you're doing so based off something other than scientific history. Maybe it's hypotheticals, circumstantial, anecdotal, but it's not based off of the evidence that we have. The best explanation for the evidence that we have is that the tomb was empty. And so I leave you with this acronym here as we consider all those things. You got the Jerusalem factor, enemy attested, testimony of women. This is JET, right? And so we use JET to remember how to prove to somebody that the tomb was empty. And so what we're left with are those 5 facts: that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples believed he was risen from the dead, that James the skeptic, his brother, was converted, became a leader in the church. Paul, he was converted from skeptic and persecutor to preacher and apostle of the church. And finally, the tomb was empty. Now, when you look at it, the most simplest, to me, best explanation simply is Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead. But that's all I have for you right now. I think what we're going to do in our next video is we're going to look at alternative explanations that people have provided for these facts. We're going to see how logical or how consistent those are with what we have established in these videos. So I really appreciate your time, appreciate your patience, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks.